welcome to another episode of East West Wednesdays. My name is Snehal Desai and I'm the producing artistic director of East West Players, and we're so glad you could join us. Today's program, as many of you know, we have a amazing and supportive board here at East West Players, comprised of over 16 individuals from our community, and they come from varying backgrounds. And so today we wanted to have a conversation with some of our board members who are also leaders in the field in terms of academia as well as in reporting. So today we'll be joined in conversation by Jeff Yang, Mei Lee, Nayan Shah, and moderated by Daniel Mayeda. So we're so glad you could join us as they talk about some of the many crucial social issues that are affecting the Asian American community today and our communities in general. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Hi everyone, welcome to East West Wednesdays. My name is Dan Mayeda, and we have a power-packed panel for you today, all comprised of members of the East West Players Board, of which I also proudly serve. Let me introduce them, and then we'll get started. First, I have Nayan Shah. He's a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at USC, an expert on Asian American history, and has written 2 award-winning books, Contagious Divides, Epidemics and Race in San Francisco's Chinatown, and Stranger Intimacy, Race, Sexuality, and Law in the North American West. You may have seen him interviewed recently on the PBS Asian Americans documentary. Next, Mei Lee, who's been a broadcast journalist for 30 years as both a US-based and international anchor, host, correspondent, and producer with major media outlets, including CNN and Oprah Winfrey's Oxygen Media. Most recently, Mei partnered with Next Shark, the leading Asian online news source, to launch The Mei Lee Show, a podcast video program where she has addressed many of the topics we will be addressing today. Mei is also an adjunct professor at USC's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Jeff Yang is a journalist, pop culture expert, and with Angry Asian Man Phil Yu, hosts a popular podcast called They Call Us Bruce. A frequent contributor to CNN Opinion, Jeff has also fully embraced a new role in recent years, father to Fresh Off the Boat's star Hudson Yang. And thank you, Jeff, for also censoring your t-shirt online today. I am a clinical professor at the UCLA School of Law, helping to run something called the Documentary Film Legal Clinic, which trains law students to represent documentary filmmakers pro bono. I also serve as a volunteer as chair of the Asian Pacific American Media Coalition, which is an umbrella organization that advocates for greater representation and inclusion of Asian Americans in Hollywood. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I want to start with some general thoughts on this really unprecedented time, this moment that we are living in. What are your hopes for this movement, for this moment moving forward? Who wants to start out?
Who has the most hope?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Since I was snarky, I'll start, and I will say that it's been an unprecedented time for Asian Americans, obviously, an unprecedented time for Black Americans, and an unprecedented moment for America. And it's very encouraging to me that we're finally getting to a point where things that should have been and have been plainly apparent for generations are finally being addressed, albeit retroactively. For us in our community, I think we have a particular special responsibility. I think that as Asian Americans, we've frequently been eluded from the conversation around race. I think that we've often been typified as the silent minority, as a passive actor in this particular dialogue that has dominated so much of American history. And I think especially as part of this larger arts community as well, we have a particular burden, I think, to break that narrative, to shatter that stereotype, and to, I've written about this before, to be loud in this time, not loud to drown out others, but loud to support others in chorus. And in this case, particularly those voices who are calling for substantive and lasting and sustained change in the racial inequities and anti-Black racism that have been such a part of American history and present.
Hey, Jeff, I'm glad you talked about being loud, because I think that's been an issue in the past. You know, like you just mentioned, we've been sort of the silent minority who has not really been seen as a community that's willing to speak up and fight back and push back. And so that's something that gives me more hope now, because I'm seeing more of that within the AAPI community than I have before. What I still don't see, though, is a cohesive effort. It's still sort of segmented and not loud enough. Now, my expectations are really high, and obviously I'm a little bit different. I'm sort of atypical because I'm a journalist, and I'm sort of hired to be loud. That's my job. And then through the show that I do, I've been trying to elevate these issues. But we do need, as a community, to come together to empower each other, to be able to know that we can make a difference and make a change. And that's why I think Black Lives Matter is coming at a really interesting time, right in the wake of, I mean, it's still going on, obviously, the xenophobia, the anti-Asian sentiment because of COVID-19, but it's really showing all of us, all communities of color, that racism and this kind of xenophobia is pervasive, and it is a problem that we all have to come together to work on together and be loud together, right, for change.
Nayan, do you agree that this is a moment that Asian Americans can find solidarity with Black Americans and move this country forward in that regard?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what we have here is a moment in which life and death are at the center of everyone's mind, whether it's about the pandemic, whether it's about the kind of violence that has been perpetuated on Black bodies, on people of color historically. So we are seeing what the terms of life and death are. And people talk about wanting to go back to normal. And I don't think we're going back. I think what we are really at the precipice of is a kind of recognition that what we had before was a world of incredible violence, disparity, and a lot of smoothing over. And I think that that's what's actually changing. That's disrupting in ways that none of us can fully grasp or understand. And I think that's okay, that none of us can fully grasp or understand that. Because I think what we're going to have to do, and what we're going to see happen, and what we're seeing emerging, is the different ways in which people find coalition, solidarity, want to work together, want to change the world that is. Because we are at a world historical moment. And it's not just a US moment. It's not just an Asian American moment. It's not just a Black American moment. It is a world moment. And I think we would have to sort of think about what kind of world do we want, because the one we had was not sustainable. And the one we had was creating all kinds of havoc and repercussions, but it was clamped down upon. And I think that eruption that we're seeing now is a really important possibility. And I do think, I agree with both Jeff and May, that there's a kind of way in which voices of Asian Pacific Americans in a variety of different ways are going to make possible those kinds of alliances, the possibility of some kind of transformation of the world that was, so that the terms of life and death change for the society and the political arrangements we want in the future.
So interesting. You know, I don't think there's any doubt that this moment, as terrible as it is shaking things up. There is not a normal right now, and people are trying to figure out how to respond to that. I will say one of the things that I find is somewhat of a silver lining is the extent to which Asian Americans are really examining our own anti-Blackness and really calling out other members of the community in very targeted ways, whether it's Asian American videos of Asian Americans wanting to speak to their immigrant parents or things along those lines. And I think that's an extremely positive thing. I want to talk about one thing that's been in the news just in the last couple of days, or it's come back into the news the last couple of days, and that's about Kung Flu.
Oh, I have something to say about that.
Let me set this up first. Let me set it up.
I'll pick it up right now. I have been going off on social media and my show about these comments that Trump has been making over and over. And he just said it yesterday. Sorry, I shouldn't say that because it's time sensitive. He said it in two different rallies. He said it in his Tulsa rally, and then he said it at another private rally to students, right? And he said Kung Flu again. And what's so vile about this is that he knows the reaction he's going to get. So he almost, sort of prepares the audience, and you can feel the swelling of, eagerness for him to spew out this bile. And so when you watch the clips, he just is a master at just waiting and waiting. And then he says, Kung Flu. And you hear the audience just roaring. And it is so, in some ways we should be used to it. But when I see it, every time I see it, I'm still so appalled that this is the president of the United States trying to rile up this kind of hatred and racism. And so, look, obviously I'm preaching to the choir here. This is not helping the situation. This is certainly not helping our situation. All the more reason, though, for us to really push back and become even more vocal about this. Now, granted, November is the way we're going to be able to, make our voices heard by voting. But even before that, we can't just sit back and be silent about things like that. We all have the tools to be able to at least express our disdain or disgust about this kind of behavior. And journalists, of course, that's our job, to call out things and question, which I think the White House correspondents try and do, sometimes unsuccessfully. But especially when it comes to Asian racism like this, what I still find disappointing is that maybe it's covered for the day and then it disappears from the news cycle. Trump would never probably say in an open rally, a derogatory term against African Americans or, maybe another larger, minority group. For some reason, Asians, it's still permitted to openly make fun of the Asian culture and Asian community. That has to change. And I notice that on a regular basis. That really has to change.
But what is the real world impact of something like that? Jeff, do you have a sense that there is is it just a joke and Asians are pissed off about it, but it really doesn't make any difference in the long run? Or does it actually have an impact?
I think that what we've seen is a shift and a normalizing effect that has occurred in how Trump has been able to control the way that people talk about the disease. I mean, if you remember, people were talking about the disease clinically, using the term coronavirus, and then the more accurate term COVID-19. And he and other GOP leaders purposely introduced this idea of tagging it to China, of essentially racializing the disease. Although they denied it, they claimed that it was simply about geographic specificity, right? Well, he's moved from calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, now to Kung Flu. And in doing so, he's kind of stripped off the mask, or the hood, as the case may be, and made it really apparent that this is not at all about geography. This is absolutely about race, and it's very specifically about racial targeting, right? So when we talk about ridiculous, playground type slurs, the kind of things that many of us may have grown up facing and hearing, being joked about based on things like, Kung Fu, or the food we eat, or the shape of our eyes, the color of our skin, the texture of our hair. These are all things that are bucketed as an easy way, a seemingly harmless way to place the burden of racial context on us and to differentiate us in a way that actually can get incredibly dangerous as time goes on. Because again, that normalizing factor of turning us into outsiders, of focusing on our difference, and then attaching that to consequences, right? In this case, saying, we're different, haha, in a joking, racialized fashion, and then saying, oh wait, hundreds of thousands of people have died in America, right? And where did it come from? It came from not China, but from people who are the target of the same kinds of ridiculous gibes and slurs as the ones that are coming out of Trump's mouth. That is to say, all of us. So that's where I think the real danger is. It's that this gradual progression towards just outright racial, catcalling, and then potentially racial violence, some of which we've seen already. But we have also seen the degree to which individual acts of violence can become state violence very quickly. So that's where I think the real fear is.
So it's interesting that just recently CBS journalist Weiji Jiang called it out to Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany,
yeah.
McEnany, and asked about that, and she said, Asian Americans are, quote, amazing people.
No.
Wait. So first she said he wasn't using president doesn't use a racist nickname. It has its origins in China. Okay, but then she said, Asian Americans are, quote, amazing people, and the spreading of the virus is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. They're working closely with us to get rid of it. We will prevail together. Clearly, it's an us versus them. We're not part of America. We're part of the other. And this is just completely in line with that worldview that I think is emanating out of this administration.
Dan, that was a statement that was written for Trump last month in for his press conference when he finally stopped saying Chinese virus.
He paused for a little while.
He read the statement that was clearly written by somebody else in his administration because they realized that he had to, try to act as if he cared.
But even that statement was.
Yeah, the wording was still us and them. Yeah,
right, absolutely. Yeah. So Nayan, you actually wrote a book about this, right? The history of Asian Americans being seen as a source of contagion.
Yeah.
How does something like Kung flu and those kinds of things, do those actually have an impact in terms of fanning the flames of bigotry in this country?
I mean, absolutely they do, because they're part of this process of stirring up a deep cauldron of racial peril. What 150 years ago in California, in San Francisco, which I wrote about, is where whether it's smallpox or cholera or syphilis or bubonic plague, every disease that came through San Francisco was attributed to the Chinese menace, the invoices of smallpox or the bubonic plague coming from China to California to somehow explain why San Francisco, where the sewers were still open, they weren't doing a lot of different things that they needed to do, that they knew they needed to do to control disease. They were using it as a way of blaming the Chinese and Chinatown. They were using it also because it was collecting other kinds of ideas. It was collecting ideas about the dirty Chinaman, the weird things that people eat, all kinds of ideas about filth and disease, about morality. It was so interesting about how it's a constellation that went from public health officers at that time and physicians to politicians to journalists to white labor activists to white women's social reformers. Even it made Chinese people sort of have to mobilize that language to say, hey, wait a minute, we really do want to get some care and treatment. We like to get into the regular San Francisco hospital. And the San Francisco officials were like, whoa. No. You are a danger. We'll put you in literally the pest house. But no matter how much we've taxed you for the hospital, we won't allow you into the hospital. And the courts themselves had some very ambivalent ideas about whether at some point where they were going to protect the Chinese or not. So this is a longer kind of history. And I mean, there's so many different parts of it. It's a long book, that Contagious Divides. It's strange to me that 20 years after I wrote it, it's become having a new life and people are looking at it. But I think it's really important to think that the ideas about dirt and disease and race, immorality, as a context to think about the us versus them battle on a deeply bodily, a deeply hygienic level is so important, because there's so much of what's going on that in which we take in science on the one hand and we take in our fear on the other. And the idea of Trump using ways of creating disease pariahs, people who are suspect, different, dangerous, could be a medical savior, but might be a medical menace, I think plays out in different ways, so that, you know, Filipino nurses and Chinese and South Asian doctors are feeling very kind of uneasy about the ways in which they're also being responded to in different ways. And I think this is going to just, it makes it part of this, the seething undercurrent of a kind of racial logic that even African Americans in the 19th century realized. You know, it's Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois who say, look at how they're treating the Chinese, look how they're treating the Japanese. This is similar to the kind of race-making, race-baiting that's been going on with Black people. Different context, different situation, but the same kind of idea of you don't matter, you're not important, you're a threat, you can be removed. And I think that that's the part that we want to sort of wonder about how that occurs, because people are experiencing on the ground in a variety of different ways these forms of racial attack that are dispersed, that are happening on the ground, as well as the stuff that's coming from the people who are authorities, people in power. And that both those levels are really important. We have a moment, we got to change the culture, we got to change the language. We got to make people see what this hatred, violence, and what the joke that seems like, oh, it's a funny joke, is actually doing to create a community of, you know, white supremacy and brown and Black peril. We have to sort of puncture that.
Nayan, thank you for reminding us of the importance of history and what we can learn from those things to try to change it this time around. So May and Jeff, I wanted to ask you guys, since you guys have both written and spoken about issues of anti-Asian violence, have you received any pushback? I think I know the answer. Have you received any pushback to those, to speaking out about these issues? And maybe you could share a little bit about that and what that means for the time we're living in, I guess.
I'll start. Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. The pushback, though, has been interesting. The more obvious pushback has just been from trolls who just want to just troll you for any reason, you know, under the sun. But what I found also that's been more interesting is the pushback from the Asian community when it comes to Black Lives Matter. And I'll tell you why. They're saying, you know, things like, we should just be focusing on our cause, and African Americans have victimized Asians, and then they'll send me a clip of some sort of crime or some sort of abuse or some sort of assault taking place. And so therefore saying, you know, we shouldn't support this like this unless we're willing to support ourselves and help our own community. And of course, my comment is, well, that's the whole point. You know, this is obviously unveiling an issue of racism, overt racism overall, but also within subgroups, the racial tensions that exist between Asians and African Americans that need to be worked on. So it's a complicated, you know, situation, but the pushback has, you know, that's been disappointing, just because I feel like there's still this division that really exists, deep divisions that exist amongst communities of color. And obviously there's a long history of that too. People always bring up, you know, the LA riots and what happened in '92. But yeah, it's something that I try to address constantly. But there are some people who are very adamant and almost militant about their position. And it's hard to convince people like that. Very tough.
So they don't internalize, or they don't understand that until there's justice for Black lives, there's not justice for all.
Right, exactly. And that's a point that I feel like this is the time to get that point across, right?
Yes.
I remember saying recently on a show, saying, listen, you guys have to understand, we should be even more empathetic right now as Asians, because we're literally living through the xenophobia and the racism from COVID-19, right? You have been living in fear because you're afraid of being assaulted because of the, what we look like. And so therefore our empathy level should be even higher right now, because we are physically being reminded right now of the racism that exists. And so I try to make it very real to the audience in terms of understanding and why we should have this kind of higher level of empathy and understanding. Whether it's working or not, I'm not sure, but it seems like I get a lot of comments from people agreeing and acknowledging the fact that this is, a way that we can all come together on this issue that we're all struggling with on different levels.
Right. And that feeling that we have as Asian Americans is something that Black Americans feel every day of their lives from the moment they're conscious of their skin color.
Exactly.
Jeff?
Yeah, actually that's my build on that really was going to be about exactly that. I will say, so I had an incident back in, I think February it was, fairly early on still, that made the kind of xenophobic attacks that are being propitiated by, the kind of language that Trump and others are using very concrete to me, right? I experienced, this sort of like quote unquote breathing while Asian moment where this older white woman essentially pulled down her mask and coughed in my direction and, shouted out "F you." And it was one of those things where, on the one hand, I was a little shocked, more because I think that we operate in a little bit of a safe zone, that Asian Americans, as much as we're frequently subjected to microaggressions and stereotyping and, all sorts of other kinds of racialized harassment, it's rare when we experience things that are deliberately and directly aggressive. And when it does happen, it's very shocking, right? There's a level of kind of privilege that we do have, this sort of white adjacent privilege that, especially those of us who've been lucky enough to, go to top colleges or to grow up in, relatively diverse settings and so forth. And when I shared it, I actually got two kinds of responses. Well, three really. I mean, there are obviously a lot of people who are empathetic, especially a lot of Asian Americans who shared their own experiences. But among a surprisingly large number of white people responding, there was actually a lot of skepticism that it had even occurred, right? There were people who were saying, oh, this is just like Jussie Smollett, Asian Americans, you're now trying to become racial victims, much like, Black people frequently are. And that was really horrifying and enraging, especially the comparison to what African Americans experience, right? But it was actually what African Americans were saying back that felt the most poignant to me, that a lot of them were saying very specifically, well, sorry to hear that happened. This is kind of how it feels like to be Black all the time. This is something which we have had to get used to growing up, that feeling of always being a beat away from aggression, from victimization, from harassment that could actually very quickly erupt into violence. So that really, I think that really underscores, what we're trying to say here, that there's a sense in which Asian Americans needing to have empathy isn't just because, it's not just a self-interest thing on some level, right? It's not just like, oh, we need to have other people believe in us, protect us, stand with us, so we should stand with others. There's a larger conversation to be had around the degree to which we need to kind of break out of our own bubbles, our own sort of sense of comfort or self-satisfaction, because none of us is free of racism until all of us is free of racism.
Absolutely. Before we leave this topic and go to some others, I do want to say something controversial and see if I can get your reaction to this. It's controversial only because, I know all of us oppose thinking of Asian Americans as the, quote, model minority, close quote. But when you think about something so simple and clearly effective as wearing a face covering, wearing a mask, right? Doesn't it seem clear that in this time of pandemic, Asian culture is simply superior to Western culture? Discuss.
Yes. I said when this pandemic started, I said, look, we need to adopt the principles of Asian culture, such as not shaking hands or hugging, we just bow. Wearing a mask when you're sick because you're being considerate. Taking off your shoes in the house. I mean, these things are just absolutely should be adopted by everyone. So, yes, I mean, I'm actually being very serious about those three things that we all should be doing. And I don't know why there's such this insane pushback to especially the mask wearing. Yeah, go.
It is insane.
I mean, the only thing I want to add to that is, I wrote an extensive piece about the history of mask wearing in Asian cultures, especially beginning in Japanese culture, right? And one thing which I think people tend to overlook, especially here in America, is that wearing a mask isn't to protect yourself, right? Wearing a mask is actually a statement of solidarity with the people around you. It's something for your community. You're trying to actually, if you are sick yourself, prevent your germs from spreading. And so there's a sense in which Asian cultures maybe have a little bit more of that sense of we need to think about the people around us, this recognition that diseases spread to the full community. And if all of us engage in this kind of prophylactic, then it protects all of us in turn. I mean, here in America, meanwhile, you got people who don't believe in vaccines. It's just like, what can you do, really? So, yeah, I don't want to call it a cultural superiority, but there's definitely like a sense of modeling that we should be taking from, frankly, societies that have done a much, much better job of restraining the spread of this pandemic.
It's so fascinating about the masks, right? Because I just remember the first time I experienced seeing people with masks on was, in India in the 1980s, and they were Jains, and they were like concerned about sentient beings, or Buddhists in Japan or in Southeast Asia. The whole idea was I'm concerned about all sentient life. I'm concerned about everyone around me. That's the principle. But yet it got enlisted into protocols around health. Just like May was suggesting, there's all these different kinds of ideas that are around. We are dealing with a pandemic that no one really truly understands. We have some ideas about it. Our scientists are working, and public health officials are working to try to understand it, how it exists, how it spreads, how it mutates. There will likely be no pure eradicating cure. We eradicated in human society smallpox once, recently. Polio has not been eradicated. Other things in which there are vaccines have not been eradicated. But we have to learn how to live with mitigating the spread, right? And so I think I want to pay attention to, I've been trying really hard to move away from just the relentless bad news about the death counts and disease and the crazy stuff coming from our president and the lack of responsibility on many different levels, to what are people doing to mitigate this this particular virus getting deep into your lungs and beginning to destroy everything. I mean, we are now understanding that it has so many other effects. So just thinking about, what do people do to stop that spread? Masks are one of those things, but there are other kinds of, and I want to pay attention to the traditional Chinese medicine. I want to pay attention to Ayurvedic medicine. I want to pay attention to people's cures about how to mitigate against respiratory collapse that would lead me to the hospital. Because like the 19th century, going to the hospital in the 19th century meant you were on your way to death. Like, it's just a 20th century phenomena. The hospital is supposed to be the place where you get cured. No, most people didn't want to go to the hospital well into the 20th century because it was a site of where the worst cases went. And guess what? Today, I don't want to go to the hospital. I don't think anyone else does anyway. And we don't want any of our loved ones to go there. We want to make sure that if someone even gets this virus, that we can find ways of mitigating its spread. So I just think that we have to think in those larger terms of really like awareness, care about all sentient life, and how we try to mitigate against the spread of this deadly virus, how we mitigate against the spread of violence. Those kinds of things are just great ideas that come from many different cultures and societies. We can build those rather than build the fear paradigm. And also do something about the security paradigm. I'm gonna just sort of make a statement here. The increase in policing, the incredible violence we see is because the securitizing idea has gotten stronger and stronger. The idea that I'm either impervious or I only protect myself in terms of health and not largely is a health security idea that's built out of the last 50 years. We gotta be different people. We have to think about what resources we have culturally, socially, politically to think about being different ethical people in the world. And I think if we can get something from the cultural resources that we may have, if we can gain something from other people's cultural resources, I'm all for it.
But Nayan, you can't cure stupid.
True.
I'm seeing a whole lot of stupid lately everywhere, and that's what's so frustrating about what's happening. Is all of what you said is absolutely correct. We would all agree, of course, but there seems to be this level of ignorance, but also selfishness and entitlement,
Mm-hmm.
and this pushback thinking. It's not about me, so I'm going to live my life the way I want to live my life.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is true, but on the other hand, this is a moment right now where there's people taking to the streets, hundreds of thousands of people, not only in this country, but all over the world, demanding for a rethinking, a refunding, or a reimagining what the security state is, or what the police departments look like, and so forth. So maybe there's some chance of making something happen. I'm going to switch to a couple more topics I want to touch upon: academia and journalism. Since we have some academics here, I know both May and Nayan teach at USC and I teach at UCLA. I want to take a moment to ask what you think about the role of academia in all of this. Aside from having to use Zoom instead of conducting our classes in person, how will our conversations with students be different this fall, if at all? What do you think?
Well, they're going to be different from the get-go, right? They're going to be different because the students are out front. Young people are out front about all of this. They want to know, and they don't think we've been telling them, professors, teachers generally, about, or maybe they've just gotten awakened to different dynamics. I joked to some colleagues and friends of mine saying like, wow, this generation was like so hard to reach, imagining that they would be so politically galvanized. I didn't know what we were doing or what we could say to help move them. And yet they're out there, they're very excited, and their self-care interests are really interesting because at the marches, they're there with the water, the masks, the snacks, they're thinking about a kind of more holistic thing, and they're taking up some of these bigger political issues. So I think the ideas about what kind of society we want to be, what kind of politics and what kind of culture got us to where we are today, and what we want to do next, I feel like there's going to be a lot more interest in that. Now, for all of us, including Jeff, who comes to universities all the time, and whose work is being read at universities, we need to find ways of reaching more deeply, because we've got a moment to really change the conversation about anti-racism, about anti-Blackness, about xenophobia, about what this place is and all of what it's done to create the kind of society it is, and what we want to do to change it. So that's my sense.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've been having a lot of different meetings with USC Annenberg for the School of Journalism. And so we're really shaping our curriculum as we speak for the graduate program and the undergraduate program, because obviously journalism is something that is being impacted by this, and the way in which things are covered and the subject matter and the topics. And so we actually are now pushing very heavily, trying to teach various classes to focus on these issues of racism and history and historical events that have impacted all of these different issues that we're dealing with right now. And you guys will be very proud of me. A lot of the conversation, of course, is about Black Lives Matter because that is the current big movement. But I did want to tell, Annenberg, and in these meetings, I made them very aware, listen, you also have to incorporate some other communities as well. You have to talk about COVID and how that's affected the Asian community, and talk about the historical events that have led up to the way Asians are seen and still treated. And so here's where representation matters in even education, right? If my voice wasn't there, and I'm the only Asian, so if my voice wasn't there, I don't think anybody else would have brought up the Asian issue. I think this would have been looked upon as a Black issue only. And I'm certainly not suggesting that's not a very important one, because clearly we all agree with that. But I think it's good to have a well-rounded, well-represented, group of people in academia as well, so that can shape the conversation and then shape the curriculum. So at USC, we're, at least at the School of Journalism, we're totally revamping, the way in which we're going to teach our students and how they can cover issues that are, gigantic as the ones we're looking at right now, in a different perspective and not so narrow.
That's great to hear. I know at UCLA Law School, we are doing this entire, re-looking at the law school curriculum, the hiring, everything, in terms of trying to figure out how do we not just be not racist, but how do we actually become an anti-racist law school? What does that look like? What does the first year curriculum in particular, which has always traditionally been focused on, what is the law, as it's been handed down over the centuries and so forth, and how does it evolve? But more talking about, we may have to sacrifice some of that amount of time spent on that kind of thing in the Black letter law to talk about the real world impacts and what kinds of things can change that, and what are the implications for today. So I'm on the EDI committee, and we're all doing all that stuff, which I think virtually every school is wrestling with right now.
I'm not an academic, much to the sadness of my parents. Did not pursue education beyond college, but I did go to a very good college, and I want to highlight some of the other ways in which I think academia is changing and needs to change, or maybe even change back is a better way of putting it, right at the same time as we're looking at other issues around social equity and inclusion. It would be remiss not to talk about the fact that on the ballots this November is going to be a referendum to overturn Prop 209 and to bring affirmative action back to California. And over the years in which Prop 209 has operated, we've seen basically a decimation in the ranks of African American and, in many cases, Latinx and other underrepresented minorities at UC, University of California Schools, at CSUs as well. And this is one of those conversations that is controversial in our community, because there are a lot of people who genuinely believe that the way these things operate is to exclude Asians at the expense of making inclusion more possible for other minority communities. My response to that is there's really no way in which you can talk about Black Lives Mattering, in which you can talk about trying to be anti-racist without engaging the fact that there are some very simple and effective tools for course correcting centuries of anti-Black racism in this country, and affirmative action is one of them. And Asian Americans do need to stand up for and with that effort. And I think most of what we see statistically, most of the surveys that are out there suggest that Asian Americans do. it's kind of like a proof point, that we have to actually engage, in November. Yes, there are things we have to do to get certain people out of office. I won't turn this into a pure politics conversation, but I think that here in California, especially, there's going to be a lot of eyes on us and where we go and where we as Asian Americans, I think, especially lead. And I am hoping that since we as an organization at East West Players is so strongly focused around the notion of inclusion and making sure that Asian Americans are represented at the tables where we are frequently not, that this is another place where we too should be leading, where we too should be playing a role to ensure that other people support that effort.
Thank you. In terms of journalism, May, you mentioned you thought it's relevant and important that you had a seat at the table in terms of discussing things at Annenberg. How much difference do you think it matters that newsrooms, after all these years, after many, many years of supposed efforts to try to diversify, still are not there? We just read recently that the LA Times is having its own issues with only one Black reporter for the entire metro section, which I guess is the largest section that they have there. What difference does it make, if any, if there are any Black or other people of color in newsrooms today? What's the impact?
I mean, it's an enormous difference, right? I mean, especially when it comes to journalism, you have to bring different perspectives to the table in covering a story. Yes, journalism, you have to be objective. I mean, that should be the case. Our media has changed so dramatically over the years. Since I started 30 years ago, it's almost unrecognizable. But still, the rule of thumb with journalism is you're supposed to be objective. However, you also want to bring experiences to the table in which you can apply those experiences and that knowledge in order to cover a story with some depth. And if you don't have those different voices to be able to add to that story and add to that narrative, then you're going to get a very myopic view of things, right? Especially when it comes to communities of color or issues that affect communities of color. So when you only have one Black reporter at the LA Times, I heard another story from a source at the LA Times that she's white, and she was in a meeting with all the executives, and he had said, "Oh, all the Asian women in the newsroom look the same." And he was dead serious in saying that. So that's still the view, because all of these major media companies are still, for the most part, run by white men. And so that's always going to be the issue when you have that kind of control there. You may have some diversity, but not enough. I will say one more thing. In my 30 years, I have tracked the media very, very closely because I had such a tough time breaking into this business at the time I did. I was trying to get my first on-air job in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's when it was the height of Japan bashing at the time. So nobody wanted to hire an Asian face to be on TV. Absolutely not. And so I experienced that from the very beginning. So I started tracking from that point to see what the representation was like. For a little while, we started getting better. And at the network level, you started seeing a few more Asian faces, but maybe one here, one there. But then it started dropping off again. And so I'm not sure why that's happening. I don't know why that trend is taking place. So we have gone forwards, but then we've gone back. And there's still this idea of we can't have too many. We can't have too many people of color, right? We'll have enough to make us look okay, but we're certainly not going to have too many. So that's still it's a problem. It's a problem.
Well, again, I hope that this is a time of change. I just was reading in Twitter that Washington Post put out several notices saying that they're hiring, 4 or 5 different positions now that are out there that they want to get filled with people of color, basically. And so I'm hoping people will be galvanized into making some of those changes. But it's clear that it does make a huge difference, as you've indicated.
Here's what I'm afraid of, though. Can I just say one thing? I'm afraid that these companies, these corporations, they put out all these grand statements and they, try to hire some people for a little while, but then they kind of go back. But what I'm afraid of is that there's going to be this knee-jerk reaction right now because everyone's just like, oh God, we have to do something. And there's going to be then a backlash, that people are going to say, oh, look, she was just hired because she's Black, or she was hired just because she was Asian. So again, it's got to be done in a organized and sort of, a scale where everyone is truly working together and there's some genuine authenticity to the changes that are long term, rather than it just coming off as this one-off knee-jerk reaction. And that's my fear, is that, I don't know. I'm fearful that the outcome is not going to be what we are hoping for.
So I hear you on that. And all I would say about that is I think that there is a risk of that. But similarly, in the TV network arena that I have some more familiarity with, a lot of them implemented diversity programs, diverse writers initiatives, et cetera. And certainly, anytime you do something like that, some people are going to say, oh, that's just a token diversity hire and so forth. But some of those so-called token diversity hires then got the experience to actually get another job, another staff position, and then writing their own stuff. Alan Yang, for instance, came out of the diversity writers initiatives, and then he went on to do the programs at Netflix, and he's got his own movie now, and so he's done a lot of different things with that kind of experience.
I think Mindy Kaling did,
in that situation. So getting in the door sometimes it may not be the best way or whatever, but just getting in the door sometimes is what some of these really talented people need.
Well, Dan, that's to your point. I mean, I think that's really important, and I want to just sort of connect both what May and Dan you're saying is that, getting through the door is one thing. Knowing that there's all sorts of different challenges to people moving further has a lot to do with the kind of work of mentoring, support, sort of trying to take care of things like worrying about, like, if the backlash hits, how to stem its flow. And I feel like right now, I mean, I'm at a stage where I can no longer say like, oh, I'm just starting out. No, I'm definitely well into my middle age. So that just means that my roles have changed, not looking just for people to support me, but to also really figure out ways of foreseeing problems and challenges down the road. And this is where I think so many of us, that are in different places, we're trying to figure out how to get people beyond that first moment and help propel larger changes so that they can begin to feel more like not just the first wave that's hit back, but rather, this kind of continuation, something that becomes so overwhelmingly part of our society. I mean, I've noticed this about just being in LA for the last, coming in and out of LA over the last 30 years. Like, all the cultural institutions in LA used to feel super white and super, unwelcoming. And many of them now are different in that way. I still look at places like East West Players as a place I feel at home, but I feel like now this pushing out is really important. And some of it's just happening on the ground. I mean, I'm worried about what's happening with all our institutions now when people have to stay at home and they can only do something at a distance, but they are the places of like meeting and greeting and thriving, where it's overwhelming to see the faces and the voices of people of color in ways that means that our entire sense of what counts as our society is changing in really important ways, and who our leaders are. And I think putting pressure again about like, who are the leaders, who are the mentors, what can we do, how can we support, encourage, and every once in a while strategically blow up things that need to be blown up, because there's just a lot of atrophying that's been going on. I feel like that, with USC, like, I feel like it's a moment, but there's some stuff that's been going on there for way too long.
Oh, for sure.
Don't let me get started about USC.
Yeah, I know. And then over there at UCLA, it's just, awesome. But, we got to look for all the places where we can keep keep moving things around. So we're not just letting them move the deck chairs, but we're actually like really like creating different kinds of new pathways. Ones that sometimes the people who are in power didn't expect, didn't know they wanted.
So I just got the 10 minutes left signal a couple minutes ago, about maybe 3 minutes ago. So one last question and then we'll have a closing round. And it's about the arts, and Nayan, you kind of set this up. So we all know the live theater is going to be the last thing to open, as people start recovering from this pandemic. And it's been said that theater is like the second responders, in the sense that long after everyone has started recovering from the initial trauma of major events, such as a pandemic or perhaps a wave of violent racism on the streets, the theater helps people process that trauma and make sense of the world around them. What do you think that theater generally can and will do, or if you have an idea about what East West Players should be doing as a second responder in the midst of our current crises? Who wants to tackle that one? Jeff,
I'll throw something out. I feel like in a lot of ways, East West Players has been pretty amazingly adaptive during this crisis. Picking up some of the best practices of other organizations, holding virtual events, doing things like this, for instance, to kind of create an ongoing conversation with audiences and constituents, stakeholders. But the biggest challenge always is going to be, how do you actually confront the reality that theater needs butts in seats? It's a physical live medium that takes place in real time in a closed room, right? And not everybody can be wearing masks, and we can't necessarily have clean room procedures. And there are a lot of ways we can mitigate, but at the end of the day, the medium itself is going to have to change. I think that at the very least, from a content side, we need to begin confronting some of the things that came out of this period. It has only been a matter of months, but it feels like forever, right? I would love to see East West Players taking the lead on helping to seed invention, right? To get people writing about this period. We all know that there are COVID stories to talk about. We all know that there are stories coming out of the protests that need to be talked about from an Asian American perspective as much as from other perspectives. It would be great if we actually were investing in that kind of storytelling, story building now. But then the other piece is format, right? Is the container around those stories. And, we've talked a lot at East West Players about new ways, new platforms, new ways to kind of extend even beyond theater as we talk about theater. Oddly enough, the networks have shown the value of live theater in an alternative platform, because some of the biggest live events, the highest rated live events on network television these days, are live theater performances, whether of musicals or even classic sitcoms that are now being, doing kind of pilot reads with new cast members. There are ways in which we can be a part of those conversations. There are ways in which we can take a lead role in developing those new ways of telling this kind of theatrical story. And it would be fantastic if we could actually be a big part of that.
Interesting. Either of the other two want to chime in on that?
That I think our virtual gala that we had recently was an example of how we had to reconfigure, obviously, from going from live to the online platform, and the way in which the staff was able to pull that together and put together some really creative content that people found so enjoyable. It was really entertaining. And so Jeff is right. I mean, we really do have to re-examine how this content is going to be delivered. And obviously the technology is there. We just have to somehow build up that audience. And I think as time goes by and more of us are continuing to use this kind of platform and getting more used to it, perhaps that's going to then allow for the audience to be adjusted to the idea that this is going to have to be the way they get their content for the time being, until this pandemic, is controlled and we get a vaccine, things like that. Listen, we just did a 40th anniversary party for CNN, and there were over 700 of us on Zoom from around the world. And there was content that was created. There were guest speakers, and it was so impressively done that it really did give me the thought, like, yeah, this is possible. If there's enough interest and you kind of generate that interest, people will participate, if the curiosity and the content is there. So that was, that's just a weird example, but it just goes to show that people are willing as long as they feel like they're part of a community, a connected community.
Yeah, I think that idea of connected community is the most important part, right? So theater is the live performance of storytelling and collaborating in all different kinds of ways to create a community. And it is a community that comes together. It also disperses and comes back. And I think the forms are obviously changing. They're changing because of necessity, but they're also probably going to change in ways that, Jeff was reaching for, the different kinds of platforms or places, or even older styles of performance that might have a different life. I mean, I do wonder, what can we do outside? What can we think about in terms of what we can make that can be duplicatable in different places, maybe simultaneously, maybe not. But I think about all the different kinds of rituals of theater that get their start in that process. And we think about this idea of why that ritual of people coming together, why this audience seeing and experiencing the story matters. Well, it certainly does. I mean, I'm getting a little tired of the pot and pan and yelling stuff going on, but I understand what's happening, right? That there's a kind of moment in which people are using voice and their bodies to the audience, which is their neighbors. And it's surely better than the fireworks all the time, but it's really interesting to think about how we are, producing different forms and creating different kinds of ways of expressing our creativity, and some of it out of joyfulness, some of it out of desperation. And so I really think it's exciting to sort of wonder and also just to experiment with what can take and what can work, and see, we're already seeing that our own ideas about what production is and how the artists of sound and the stage sort of need to come together with actors in really exciting ways, and writers. So, it's going to be interesting to sort of see. We have a moment to sort of maybe have a sense of, let's look forward. But what's going to be so weird about this is that we're going to be taped. And then, 6 months from now, we'll get to look back at this tape and say, what stories did we create? What politics do we do? What change do we make? And not to sort of expect that it would be all the things we would most dream for and imagine, but some of those dreams are going to get out there and circulate in ways that we can't even imagine, and come back to us with a breathtaking force. I'm looking forward to seeing that at East West Players, but I'm looking forward to seeing that everywhere and being amazed and astonished again.
What a wonderful close, Nayan, on that. I am, for one, excited and proud to be serving on a board of an organization that really is thinking about these things and actually making moves to figure out the best way to reach audiences, to connect people, to address the pressing issues of the day as we are. So that's very exciting. I don't know how much time we have left, but maybe 30 seconds around the horn. How are you practicing self-care in this moment, or any other final thoughts you want to provide us?
I have two very furry dogs who I adore to death, so they keep me sane. I do a lot of paddleboarding, and being on the water keeps me sane, and some yoga, and I'm cooking more, which is a joke. That I never cook. So there you go.
I will echo the therapy aspect of it. I have a Shiba Inu who has been a great source of comfort in these times. Sort of like, full facial fur is sometimes the only way to get stress off your brain. I've actually, weirdly enough, I've been kind of working out, and I've lost weight during this I know I'm instantly now like everybody hates me, but I gained a lot of weight right beforehand, and I think this actually ended up being a good opportunity to work on work on myself in that way. So yeah, I'm just gonna flex on you a little.
I've been cooking. I've been experimenting with whatever food I can put in together and see what happens, and see if my partner will actually eat it or not. And I've been hiking. And I feel like I've been going deeper and deeper into the Angeles National Forest and going on hikes I never imagined I would take. But they've been breathtakingly beautiful. I mean, they're kicking my butt because I am not in so good shape as Jeff is. But I've been enjoying myself tremendously being out in nature, and, masking when I see someone. But really, when you go out deep in the Angeles National Forest, there aren't that many people. There are more bears. But I haven't met any bears.
Good for you. As for me, cooking, a lot more cooking than usual, which has been kind of fun. But also, I mean, I know this is like a no big deal thing for most people, but I actually have been watching more TV, which I hardly ever do. A lot of stuff on Netflix, and so that's been fun to see. There's so much Asian American content now. You can just do Asian American content and take up all your time. But so that's been a lot of fun. Anyways, thank you so much, guys, for joining in this conversation. I really had a good time, and I think this will close it up.
It's not simple to say that most days I don't recognize me, that these shoes and this apron, that place and its patrons have taken more than I gave them. It's not easy to know I'm not anything like I used to be, although it's true I was never attention's sweet center. I still remember that girl. She's imperfect, but she tries. She is good, but she lies. She is hard on herself. She is broken and won't ask for help. She is messy, but she's kind. She is lonely most of the time. She is all of this mixed up and baked in a beautiful pie. She is gone, but she used to be mine. It's not what I asked for. Sometimes life just slips in through a back door and carves out a person who makes you believe it's all true. And now I got you, and you're not what I asked for. If I'm honest, I know I would give it all back for a chance to start over and rewrite an ending or two. For the girl that I knew who will be reckless just enough, who'll get hurt, but who learns how to toughen up when she's bruised and gets used by a man she'll get stuck and be scared of the life that's inside her, growing stronger each day till it finally reminds her to fight just a little to bring back the fire in her eyes that's been gone but used to be mine. kind. She is lonely most of the time. She has all of this mixed up and baked in a beautiful pie. She is gone, but she used to be mine. Thanks again, Peter. Take care. God bless.